The boy had been dead to the world for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Not dead in the way that mattered to hospitals or police reports, or the thin manila folders that passed between overworked caseworkers in fluorescent-lit offices. Dead in the quieter, more complete way. The kind of dead where no one notices the absence. The kind of dead where the machine keeps moving and the empty space you leave behind gets filled by the next broken thing that needs processing. The kind of dead that the system that was supposed to protect you produces so efficiently and with such minimal friction that you begin to suspect it was the intended outcome all along. Eli Voss was 17 years old, and he had made himself disappear on purpose. The story of how a person ends up living alone in a national forest at 15 is not a complicated story, though the people who hear it sometimes want it to be. They want there to be a single catastrophic event, a dramatic rupture, something large enough to justify the outcome. The truth was more ordinary and therefore more damning. Eli Voss had entered the California foster care system at age 9 when his mother, a woman named Carol, who had loved him in the incomplete way that people love things they do not have the capacity to sustain, had left him in the waiting room of a Redding County office with a note safety pinned to his jacket and had not come back. He had cycled through 11 placements over 6 years. Not all of them were bad. 2 of them had people in them who were genuinely trying. But the system moved children the way water moves sediment, not with intention, but with the indifferent force of its own structure, and good placements ended for reasons that had nothing to do with the children in them. Budget reallocations, licensing issues, foster parents who aged out or burned out, or simply decided that the emotional mathematics of the work no longer balanced in any way they could sustain. By 15, Eli had developed a comprehensive education in the specific ways that institutions failed people. He understood the mechanics of neglect, not the dramatic prosecutable kind, but the ambient kind, the neglect of systems too large and underfunded to register individual human beings as anything more than case numbers requiring periodic processing. He had learned that the people running those systems were not for the most part malicious. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and working with resources that had been inadequate for decades. This understanding did not make the experience of being processed by those systems any more bearable. It simply made it comprehensible. The last group home had been a converted 2-story on the edge of Eureka, California, where the fog came in so thick some mornings you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. There had been 6 boys in that house ranging in age from 11 to 16, supervised by a man named Garrett, who smelled permanently of menthol cigarettes and collected his paycheck with the enthusiasm of someone who had long ago stopped seeing the children as children. He was not cruel in any active sense. He was absent in the way that a piece of furniture is absent present in the space, but generating no warmth, providing no function beyond occupying the required position. His disengagement had created a vacuum, and vacuums in houses full of damaged adolescent boys filled with whatever the strongest boy in the room decided to put in them. The strongest boy in the room was a thick-armed 16-year-old named Decker, who had been in the system since birth and had learned to survive it by becoming everything it produced. Garrett's practiced blindness was for Decker a resource. The other 5 boys in the house were for Decker a resource. Everything was a resource to be extracted, and Decker extracted with the systematic efficiency of someone who had never been taught that other people's pain was a relevant consideration. Eli had been there 4 months, long enough to understand the hierarchy, long enough to know which floorboards creaked at night, long enough to map every exit and every sightline from every window and every position of vulnerability in that house, because mapping exits and sightlines and positions of vulnerability was what you did when the thing you needed protection from was inside the building with you. The night he left, Decker had broken 2 of his ribs over a plate of canned beans. Not for any particular reason. Because he could. Because Garrett was watching television in the other room, and the volume was high enough, and the distance was sufficient, and the institutional indifference was complete enough that nothing would happen afterward, except that Eli would have 2 broken ribs, and Decker would have confirmed again the fundamental operating principle of his world. Eli had lain on the thin mattress for 2 hours after lights out, breathing through the pain with the shallow, controlled breaths of someone who had learned that deep breaths with broken ribs were a decision rather than a reflex, and he had listened to the house settle into silence around him. He had taken inventory of what he owned. The hunting knife he had found 6 months earlier in the woods behind home number 4, a fixed blade with a 4-inch carbon steel blade, and a handle wrapped in black electrical tape that had dried and cracked over years of prior use. A canvas jacket that had been donated to the house's communal closet and that he had appropriated because it fit, and because it was warm, and because in a house without locks, the concept of property operated on different terms than the law suggested. A mental map built over 4 months of deliberate observation of the surrounding terrain, extending roughly 3 miles in every direction from the house. He had gotten up, pulled on the jacket, taken the knife, and walked out the back door into the Eureka fog. He had not looked back, not because he felt nothing about leaving. He felt a complicated aggregate of things that he did not have adequate language for at 15. But because looking back was a category of action that did not serve any practical function, and he had already begun without fully articulating it to himself the process of reorganizing his entire behavioral repertoire around the principle of practical function. He had walked north and then east into the mountains, away from the roads, away from the towns, away from every system and structure that had ever claimed to be keeping him safe. The Mendocino National Forest had swallowed him whole on the third day when he crossed from the maintained trail network into primary old growth on the eastern slope of a ridge that the maps designated as inaccessible to foot traffic without specialized equipment. The maps were wrong, or rather they were written for a category of person who had different assumptions about acceptable risk than Eli did at that moment. The forest had not welcomed him. That was important to understand. There was nothing romantic about the first months. The hunger was real and continuous and had a specific quality that was different from the ordinary hunger of missed meals. It was hunger that came with an awareness that there was no meal coming, that the gap between current state and adequate nutrition was entirely his problem to solve with whatever the environment made available. The cold was structural, not incidental, the kind of cold that lived in the ground and the air simultaneously and worked on a person from both directions at once. He had been sick twice in the first month, sick in the way that a person gets sick when their immune system is managing a new microbial environment, while simultaneously dealing with inadequate nutrition and sustained cold exposure, and both times he had been genuinely uncertain whether he would recover. He had recovered, and he had learned. He learned the way a person learns when the alternative to learning is death, not with the distributed attention of a student who knows there will be other opportunities to acquire the information, but with the total undivided focus of someone for whom each lesson is immediately load-bearing. He learned which mushrooms would sustain him and which would end him, and the difference between them was sometimes subtle enough that he spent his first autumn building a reference system in the margins of a waterlogged field guide he had salvaged from a trailhead information kiosk, annotating every entry with the specific sensory details that allowed confident identification in the field. He learned to read the sky and the soil and the movement of animals. He learned to build a Dakota firehole, a narrow 2-chamber pit that channeled oxygen from underground and burned hot and nearly smokeless, invisible from more than 20 yards in any direction. He learned to set snares from high-tensile wire salvaged from a collapsed fence on the forest's eastern boundary, and he learned the specific patience required by snare trapping, the patience of someone who had committed to a process and was willing to wait for the process to produce its result without substituting anxiety for action. He learned that sphagnum moss, the thick green carpet that blanketed every wet corner of the Mendocino wilderness, had natural antiseptic properties that had kept field medics supplied for centuries before pharmaceutical companies decided nature wasn't profitable enough. He learned to be silent. This was perhaps the most important lesson and the one that took the longest to fully internalize, because silence was not simply the absence of noise. Not just physically quiet, though that too, moving through dense undergrowth, without disturbing a single branch crossing a creek, without dislodging a stone approaching an open clearing, with the specific ground reading that kept his footfalls below the threshold of ambient forest sound. He learned the deeper silence, the silence of a person who has accepted that no one is listening and stopped needing them to. The silence of someone who has reduced their relationship with the world to its essential terms and found that the essential terms were manageable in a way the inessential ones had never been. By the end of the first winter, Eli Voss was something the forest recognized as its own. He had a camp, not a camp in the way that word conjured images of canvas tents and campfire songs. A network of concealed positions across a 3-mile radius, each stocked with specific resources connected by routes he had memorized and could navigate at full speed in complete darkness. He had mapped every trail road, creek ridge, a natural shelter within 10 miles, annotating the hand-drawn chart with seasonal variations which creek crossings became impassable in the spring runoff, which ridgelines channeled wind in ways that made fire building difficult in November, which sections of old growth provided adequate canopy cover for shelter building during the extended November rains. His primary shelter was a natural cavity beneath the root system of a Douglas fir so massive it had been old when the logging companies first pushed into Mendocino in the 1930s. The entrance was 3 feet wide and completely hidden behind a wall of living fern. Inside, the space opened to a chamber nearly 8 feet across the dirt floor, packed smooth and dry, the root ceiling overhead dense enough to shed rain. He had lined the floor with layered pine duff for insulation and covered that with a section of emergency mylar blanket he had found in an abandoned ranger cache. He had 2 wool blankets, a waterproof cylinder containing fire materials, the hunting knife. The hunting knife was everything. He had sharpened it so many times the blade had developed a slight concavity along its edge, the steel worn down by years of use against a flat piece of sandstone he kept wrapped in oilcloth near his primary shelter. The electrical tape had long since been replaced by paracord wound in a tight overlapping spiral that provided grip in wet conditions and could be unwound and used as cordage in emergencies. It was not an impressive weapon by any conventional measure. It was a tool that had been used so extensively and maintained so carefully that it had developed a specific personality the way tools do when they become extensions of the person using them rather than objects existing independently of that use. On the morning of day 729, he had been keeping count scratched into the bark of a young pine near his primary shelter in groups of 5, like a man in a cell, the marks accumulating with the patient regularity of someone who understood that the only way to cross a very long distance was 1 unit at a time. Eli woke before dawn and lay still for 3 minutes listening to the forest breathe around him. This was a habit he had built without ever consciously deciding to build it. Silence first always. Listen to the bass line before you move. The forest had a sound when everything was right, a low constant murmur of wind and water, and small creatures going about the business of being alive, a composite that his nervous system had learned to read the way a musician learns to hear individual instruments within a full orchestra. And it had a different sound when something was wrong, when that composite shifted even fractionally from its established pattern. When the bass line changed, Eli's body registered it before his mind caught up a cold tightening in the chest, a slowing of breath, the ancient machinery of prey animal awareness coming online with the automatic efficiency of a system that had been calibrated by months of practice. This morning, the baseline was correct. The woodpeckers were active on the eastern slope. The creek below the north ridge was running at its usual late November volume. The wind through the upper canopy had the quality of an established weather pattern rather than an approaching front. He rose. It was a Tuesday in late November. He knew this not from a calendar, but from the quality of the light filtering through the fern wall and the temperature which had dropped overnight to something just above freezing, the particular cold that settled into the Mendocino highlands in the weeks before December turned serious. The sky above the canopy, visible in fragments through the gaps in the fir branches, was the color of a bruised plum, deep purple shading to green at the horizon, the clouds pressing low and heavy with the weight of an incoming storm. The air smelled of ozone and cold earth and the faint, clean bitterness of pine resin and the specific metallic edge that meant real rain was 4 to 6 hours out. Eli ate a small breakfast, 2 strips of dried rabbit jerky, and a handful of dried huckleberries from a stock he had been building since August, and then pulled on his canvas jacket and moved out into the forest. He moved through his morning routine with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom the routine had become sufficiently internalized that it no longer required conscious management. Check the snares, note the mushroom stand on the fallen maple near the north ridge. Assess the creek level. Read the weather from the secondary indicators. Bark moisture, bird behavior. The behavior of the deer he occasionally saw on the lower meadow at first light. He had a route. 3 snares set along the eastern creek drainage, 2 more on the slope, above the old logging road that cut through the lower valley. He moved between these points in a sequence he varied daily, never establishing a pattern that could be tracked. Not because he had any specific reason to believe anyone was looking for him. He was quite certain that his name had cycled through whatever administrative process the state of California applied to runaway foster children and had come out the other side, stamped with something that meant closed file, that the caseworker assigned to him had noted the absence in the required documentation and moved on to the next entry in a caseload that was already 30% above recommended capacity. He varied his route because it was good practice, and good practice was the only thing standing between him and a bad outcome. You did not get to be sloppy about the things that kept you alive. The forest had taught him this with the patient absolute consistency of a teacher who had no investment in whether the student found the lesson enjoyable. He found the tire tracks at 7:40 in the morning. He almost missed them. They were set into the north face of a steep bank where the ground was perpetually soft, sheltered from direct sunlight by a wall of interlocking madrone trees. And they were partially obscured by the overnight rain, the edges of the deep tread impressions already beginning to soften and collapse inward. But Eli had walked this section of forest so many hundreds of times that he registered the disturbance without consciously looking for it, the way you register a missing tooth with your tongue before your brain has time to form the question. He stopped, crouched, studied. The tracks were wide, aggressive tread, the kind that belonged to a heavy truck running modified all-terrain tires. Chevrolet or Ford 3/4 ton, he estimated, from the track width and the depth of the impression, loaded or with substantial hardware in the bed, given how deep the rear tires had bitten into the soil. 2 passes, the overlapping patterns told him in and out, or in and still there. The tracks led upslope northeast into terrain that had no business accommodating a vehicle of this size. The logging road was half a mile south. This was not the logging road. This was old-growth primary forest with gradient changes that would beach a standard 4x4 within 50 yards. Whoever had driven up here knew exactly what they were doing and had a vehicle specifically modified to do it. Eli remained crouched for a long moment, his forearms resting on his knees, the knife on his belt. His first rule, the one he had written in his mind in the first weeks of his forest life, and never revised the rule that had kept him invisible and safe for 2 years and 4 months, was to avoid human contact at all costs. Human contact meant questions. Questions meant systems. Systems meant everything he had walked away from. The calculus was simple and had been simple from the beginning and had never given him a reason to revise it. But the tracks were fresh. The mud was still actively settling into the impressions, tiny rivulets of water finding new paths through the compressed earth. An hour old, possibly less. And they went up into the forest, into territory where no one had any legitimate reason to be carrying whatever weight had compressed the soil that deeply, for whatever purpose, had justified the difficulty of the approach. Eli stood up, looked northeast up the slope where the tracks disappeared into the trees, looked south toward his snares and his mushroom stand and the uncomplicated routine of a morning that had been entirely predictable until 30 seconds ago. He followed the tracks. He moved without sound, cutting parallel to the track line, rather than following it directly, staying 15 feet upslope, where the ground was rockier and his footfalls left no impression. He kept his breathing controlled and shallow. The Mendocino morning was completely still, except for the distant percussion of a woodpecker somewhere to his west, and the low, constant sound of wind moving through the upper canopy 100 feet above his head. The tracks led up for 600 yards, the incline steepening, the trees thinning slightly as the canopy opened to accommodate a small natural clearing that Eli had cataloged 18 months earlier as a feature of no particular significance. An old logging staging area from the previous century, the ground still faintly compacted beneath decades of regrowth, ringed by second-growth Douglas fir and tangled berry vines. He smelled it before he saw it. Exhaust. The particular chemical residue of a gasoline engine that had been running hard and recently stopped the heat of the manifold, still releasing hydrocarbon vapor into the cold morning air. And beneath the exhaust, something else fainter, harder to name, the synthetic chemical smell of processed materials, plastic and solvent. The smell of equipment that had been stored somewhere warm and recently brought out into the cold. He flattened himself against the base of a massive fir and went completely still. The clearing was small, perhaps 40 yards across. In its center stood what remained of a logging cabin that had been abandoned long enough for the forest to begin its patient dismantling. The roof had partially collapsed under the accumulated weight of decades of moss and pine duff, the south-facing wall bowing outward at a dangerous angle, the wood everywhere dark and soft with rot. The structure was held together more by habit than by any remaining structural integrity, the way some things persist not because they are strong, but because nothing has yet applied sufficient force to make them stop. Parked directly in front of the cabin's sagging door was a Chevrolet Silverado matte black, the kind of finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, the kind of choice a person made when they specifically did not want to be seen in conditions where being seen might have consequences. The truck was a 3/4 ton, exactly as Eli had read from the tracks. Modified suspension lifted 3 inches above stock heavy brush guard, on the front a rack of auxiliary lights across the top of the cab that were currently dark. The engine was ticking rhythmically as it cooled. 2 men stood at the cabin door. Eli studied them with the focused, dispassionate attention he had learned to apply to everything that entered his field of observation. Both were large, the kind of large that came from deliberate physical maintenance, rather than simple genetics, broad across the shoulders, heavy through the chest. They wore canvas work jackets over what appeared to be tactical vests, the kind with multiple external pockets at specific positions that Eli recognized from the catalog of military surplus equipment he had studied in the library in Cavallo on 2 of his 3 cautious trips to town in 2 years. Heavy, mud-caked boots, one of them taller with a scar that ran from the hinge of his jaw down to his collarbone. The skin there a different shade tighter. Where it had healed badly and without adequate medical attention, had a pump-action shotgun slung over his shoulder with the practiced casualness of someone who had been carrying a long gun long enough that it had ceased to register as a distinct object and had become simply a part of how he moved through the world. The other man was heavier with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of stillness that came from professional comfort, with violence not the stillness of patience, but the stillness of someone who had learned that unnecessary movement was wasted energy. The scarred one sparked a cigarette, took a long drag, and exhaled slowly into the cold air. The smoke drifted northeast on the light wind directly toward Eli's position. He held absolutely still. "Give her an hour to think about it," the scarred man said. His voice was unhurried, flat, the voice of someone delivering routine logistical instructions. "If she doesn't give up Callaway's stash house by the time we get back, we take a finger. Briggs's orders." The heavier man made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "Briggs wants her breathing, Harlan. Just remember that." "I know what Briggs wants." Harlan took another drag and spat sideways into the mud. "Her breathing and her talking are 2 different requirements." He was very specific about breathing. He was less specific about the configuration she does it in. He dropped the cigarette and ground it under his boot. "Go grab the gear from the lower cache and lock the door." The heavier man disappeared inside the cabin for a moment. The sound of a heavy padlock being worked through a hasp, the metallic click of the shackle engaging. The 2 men climbed into the Silverado without further conversation. The engine turned over with the deep, authoritative rumble of a modified V8, and the truck backed out of the clearing and picked its way down the slope, the sound of it fading, gradually absorbing into the ambient noise of the forest until it was entirely gone. Eli counted to 300. He stood completely still against the fir trunk, watching the clearing, listening to the forest recalibrate itself after the intrusion. The woodpecker had gone silent during the voices and was beginning to work again now, the rhythmic percussion resuming from the eastern slope. Small birds that had scattered at the truck's approach were returning to the canopy above the clearing. The forest composite sound was reasserting itself, filling in the space the human noise had displaced. He said nothing to himself. He did not argue with himself or deliberate extensively. The deliberation had already happened, in a sense, in the 2 years of living in this forest, the extended ongoing deliberation about what kind of person you became when you stripped away everything that wasn't necessary. He had believed before this morning that he had settled that question, that the answer was simple: you became the kind of person who survived. You became the kind of person who assessed every situation against the single criterion of whether engagement served or threatened your continued existence, and you acted accordingly, and you did not allow the emotional residue of your previous life to interfere with that assessment. And then he heard a man say, "We take a finger," and he found out that he had not in fact settled the question at all. There was a person in that cabin. Someone had locked that person in. 2 men with weapons and tactical vests had used the specific language of mutilation as a casual workplace instruction, the same tone you use to discuss a supply run or a schedule change. Whatever was happening in that cabin was happening to someone who could not leave, and it would continue to happen, and it would get worse, and no one else was coming. He moved. He crossed the clearing in a low, fast diagonal, staying out of the direct sight line from the track the truck had used, reaching the cabin wall without ever fully standing upright. Up close, the rot was even more advanced than it had looked from the tree line. He pressed one hand flat against the siding and felt the wood compress slightly under his palm, soft as wet bread, the structural integrity long since returned to the soil from which it had come. He moved around to the rear of the structure away from the door and the padlocked hasp. The foundation was where old cabins always failed first. Down here, where the untreated wood met the perpetually damp soil, decades of moisture had worked its way into the grain, with the patient thoroughness of water finding every weakness, and the wood had returned cell by cell to its constituent elements. He ran his hands along the base of the rear wall until he found what he was looking for. A section 3 feet wide where the wood had separated from the foundation sill, held in rough position only by the weight of the wall above it and by decades of accumulated debris that had partially filled the gap. He worked his fingers into the gap, got purchase on the inner face of the board and pulled. The board came away with a soft tearing sound that he suppressed against the noise of the wind, bringing with it a cascade of rotten splinters and dark, wet wood fiber, and the smell of concentrated decay, the sweet, dense smell of organic material completing its return cycle. The gap was 18 inches high. He went flat, wormed through on his stomach with his arms extended ahead, feeling the cold mud of the underfloor space against his chest and thighs, pulling his hips through the narrowest point, and emerged into the cabin's interior in a controlled roll that brought him immediately to his feet and against the interior wall. The smell hit him first. Stale beer and the sourness of old wood, and beneath both of those, something sharp and metallic and recent. Blood. Not old blood, not the phantom traces that clung to abandoned places where violence had once occurred and been absorbed over time. Fresh blood had a specific quality that was more sensation than smell, something that operated on the nervous system below the level of conscious identification. The thing that made the hair rise on the back of a person's neck in the fraction of a second before the mind caught up with what the body had already registered. The interior of the cabin was a single room, perhaps 20 feet by 15. The floor rough-hewn planks with gaps between them wide enough to show the dirt below. Most of the light filtered through those gaps and through a series of holes in the roof where the moss-weighted shingles had given way over the years and been replaced by nothing. It was a dim, gray, underwater kind of light, everything reduced to shapes and gradations of darkness, rather than clear outlines, the kind of light that required a moment of adjustment before the eye could assemble reliable information from it. In the center of the room, a structural post, a single full-length fir trunk, the bark still on it, that had been incorporated as a load-bearing column when the cabin was built, rose from floor to ceiling. And tied to that post was a person, a girl. Eli's age may be a year older, hard to determine with certainty in this light and in these circumstances. She was wearing heavy denim jeans and a thick black leather jacket, the kind with reinforced shoulders and a heavy zipper that ran at an angle across the chest. The kind of jacket that was made for a specific context and communicated that context clearly to anyone who knew the vocabulary. Her head was down, a fall of dark brown hair, matted and damp, with what he already knew was blood hanging forward and obscuring her face. Her arms were behind the post, her wrists bound with heavy-gauge plastic zip ties that had cut deep enough into the skin to turn both her hands a bruised violet color. The circulation compressed so thoroughly that her fingers had begun to swell and separate slightly, taking on the specific swollen geometry of tissue deprived of adequate blood flow. Her ankles were similarly bound, the plastic biting into the leather of her boot tops. A double layer of silver duct tape was wrapped twice around her mouth, conforming to the contours of her face, with the thoroughness of someone who had done this before and knew the common failure modes. The right side of her jacket was dark with blood. The leather absorbed it differently than fabric would, staying slick rather than drying to a stiff crust, the dark patch spreading from her right shoulder down to her ribs. A wound on her head, partially visible through the matted hair, was still weeping slowly, the blood mixing with the condensation in her hair and tracking down the right side of her neck in thin, dark lines. Eli took one step forward and the floorboard under his boot shifted with a sharp creak. The girl's head snapped up. What hit him first was not the blood or the bound wrists or the tape. It was her eyes. They were open wide, bloodshot from whatever blow had opened the wound on her head, and they were absolutely fixed on him with an intensity that cut through the dim light of the cabin and registered with physical force. The intensity contained in rapid sequence terror, and then something behind the terror that was neither resignation nor acceptance, something active and analytical. She was looking at him and assessing him in the same moment, processing. Even now in this condition, she was processing. She thrashed against the post immediately, a muffled sound tearing through the duct tape, her boots hammering against the plank floor, the zip ties cutting deeper as she fought against them. Eli crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped to his knees beside her. He held both hands up, palms out, fingers spread. Empty hands. The knife was visible on his belt, but his hands were away from it. He kept his voice below the threshold that would carry through the cabin walls, pitched to carry exactly as far as her ears. I'm not with them. I'm going to cut you loose. You have to be quiet. She stopped thrashing. Her breathing was rapid and audible, even through the tape, her chest heaving under the leather jacket. She looked at his hands, looked at the knife on his belt, looked at his face with those assessing eyes, reading the information available. The hollow cheeks, the dirt embedded in the creases of his knuckles, in the way that only came from sustained outdoor living, rather than a single day's work. The canvas jacket washed so many times in creek water that its original color was a matter of speculation. The eyes that were too old for his face, carrying the specific flatness of someone who had not been surprised by the world's capacity for cruelty in a very long time. She gave a small, precise nod. He moved. He slid the blade of the knife between the zip tie and the inside of her left wrist, angling the edge carefully away from the skin. There was room barely because the tie had cut in enough to create a defined channel between plastic and flesh, and cut upward with a single controlled motion. The plastic parted. He repeated the process on the right. She exhaled a sharp, involuntary sound through the tape as blood surged back into her hands. The sudden return of circulation producing a pain that was, he knew from experience, almost as severe as the compression itself, the nerve endings firing at full intensity as perfusion was restored. He cut the ankle bindings. Then he gripped the edge of the duct tape at her cheekbone, met her eyes, and pulled it away in one clean motion. She inhaled like someone surfacing from deep water, a massive, ragged breath that shook her whole body, followed by a coughing fit that she suppressed with obvious effort, turning her face into her shoulder and muffling the sound against the leather of her jacket. "Who are you?" she said when she had her breath back. Not a question exactly. An assessment being conducted at speed, the query stripped of its interrogative inflection by urgency. Nobody. He was already looking at the wound on her head, reaching up to move the matted hair aside to get a clear view of the gash. A laceration 4 centimeters, approximately, the edges irregular in the way that indicated blunt force rather than a blade. Shotgun butt possibly, or a rifle stock. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped entirely, the wound weeping slowly in the specific way that scalp wounds did. High vascularization in the scalp meant they bled significantly, even when not particularly deep, and they kept going long after wounds in other locations would have self-sealed. "Can you stand?" "I can stand." She proved it, pushing herself upright, using the post for leverage, swaying once as her legs recalibrated their function after hours of restricted circulation, catching herself with a hand against the post. Her knees were unsteady, but her spine was straight, and the look in her eyes was alert in a way that partially contradicted what the rest of her presentation suggested. "They hit me with the butt of a shotgun about 12 hours ago. 12 hours of intermittent bleeding from a scalp wound. No serious vessel involvement given that she was still conscious and coherent, survivable if the blood loss remained what it was." He filed this, not the word, not the habit he used as shorthand in his own internal narration, but the action itself, the process of taking information and placing it where it could be accessed quickly. She had been here approximately 12 hours. She had been conscious for portions of that time and unconscious for others given the head injury. Her hands and feet were compromised from the zip tie restriction and would need time to fully restore function. "We need to leave," he said. "They said 1 hour. We don't know exactly how long they've been gone." "I know exactly how long they've been gone." She moved toward the door and stopped when she registered the padlock, and something moved through her expression. Not frustration, something more operational than that. An obstacle being noted and categorized. 14 minutes. They make a 40-minute round trip to the lower cache each time. We have 26 minutes before they return. She looked at him. "How did you get in?" He pointed at the rear wall. She looked at the gap near the floor, and something passed across her face that was almost briefly something like dark humor, a compression at the corner of her mouth that was too controlled to be a smile, but had the same underlying quality. "Of course." She moved toward the gap, then stopped. "My name is Rain. Eli." "Eli." She said it once with the specific intonation of someone filing a reference. Then she went to her hands and knees and began working herself through the gap, moving through it with the methodical efficiency of someone whose body was not fully cooperating, but whose will was providing the gap. They emerged from beneath the cabin into the muddy strip between the foundation and the tree line. Rain straightened up, took 3 deliberate breaths, and swept the tree line in both directions with a look that was systematic rather than panicked, left to right, pausing at the natural cover points, assessing. She was doing what he had done at the tree line when he first approached the cabin, except she was doing it with a head injury and compromised circulation in both hands. Which way? Northeast. Ridge above breaks the sight line from the approach track. We need to cross it before... The sound reached them before he finished the sentence. Not from the approach track. From lower on the slope from the direction of the logging road rising through the trees with the specific acoustic quality of a heavy vehicle working its way uphill over rough ground. The deep authoritative rumble of a modified V8. The Silverado, early. Eli grabbed her wrist and they moved. Not running in dense undergrowth at speed was how you twisted an ankle or caught a branch across the face or made noise that carried 300 yards through cold mountain air. Moving. Fast and controlled and deliberate. Eli in front and Rain a half step behind, following his exact path through the ferns and around the root masses and under the low-hanging madrone branches. He had a destination in mind before they took the first step. A quarter-mile northeast, the ground dropped into a natural bowl where a massive redwood had come down decades ago, its fall creating a 40-foot trench in the forest floor that had since filled with new growth. Beneath the root mass at the uphill end of that trench, where the roots had torn from the earth and the trees falling, was a cavity that Eli had been using as a secondary shelter since his first winter. He called it the belly. No one else had ever called it anything. No one else knew it existed. Rain was running on adrenaline in the specific way that seriously injured people ran on adrenaline powerfully, and with a very clear endpoint after which the body would collect on everything it had deferred. She kept pace for the first 300 yards, moving through the undergrowth with a competence that registered even in Eli's peripheral awareness, even at speed. She knew how to move through dense vegetation. She kept her weight low, used her arms to redirect branches rather than pushing through them, placed her feet with attention to what was under them. Then her left boot caught a buried root she hadn't seen in the dark understory, and she went down hard, the wet ground receiving her with a sound he couldn't suppress. He had her back on her feet before she finished the process of falling. "I'm fine," she said. Her face was the color of old ash and she was holding her left wrist against her chest where she had caught herself on the ground. "Keep moving." The belly received them. The entrance was behind a curtain of living briar that Eli navigated through a specific sequence of bends and angles through the thorns that he had worked out by trial and error. Over 18 months, a path that was invisible to anyone who didn't know it existed, and required precise execution to traverse without taking significant damage from the thorns. He guided Rain through with his hand at her back, talking her through each turn quietly, and they dropped into the cavity together. It was exactly as he had left it 48 hours earlier. Dry, packed dirt floor root ceiling, 6 feet overhead, the walls formed by the massive interlocking root mass of the fallen tree, the space 12 feet across at its widest point. It smelled of dry earth and old wood, and the specific clean mineral smell of deep forest shelter. Outside, the rain had resumed, progressing from the earlier drizzle to something steadier, and the sound of it against the forest canopy above was a constant low white noise that covered all other sound at this distance. Rain sat down against the earthen wall and allowed for just a moment her head to rest back against the roots. Her eyes closed. She was breathing with deliberate control, 4 counts in 4 counts, out the specific breathing of someone actively managing pain rather than reacting to it. She had been doing this since the moment the tape came off, he realized. She had been controlling her breathing and her presentation the entire time, performing functional capacity for his benefit or for her own. Eli built the fire. He kept materials here in a waterproof cylinder tucked into a recess in the root wall. Dry lint, matches sealed in wax, a small quantity of fatwood shavings from a long-dead pine, pencil-diameter sticks for first-stage fuel. He dug the fire hole the way he always dug it. 2 connected chambers angled to draw combustion air from below the opening, small to burn hot and concentrated. The flame caught on the second match. He fed it progressively, keeping the output small, and controlled the Dakota fire hole design consuming its own combustion products with an efficiency that produced almost no visible smoke and almost no light visible beyond 10 feet. Then he turned to the wound on her head. He went to the briar entrance, reached through, gathered a double handful of sphagnum moss from the damp ground immediately outside. He brought his canteen out from its place in the root wall full from a spring 200 yards east that had been running clean since he first found it. He tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt, the fabric there being the cleanest material he had ready access to, and folded it into a compress that would apply pressure evenly across the wound's length. "This is going to hurt," he said. "Everything hurts already." She tilted her head to the left, moving the matted hair away from the wound and giving him access to it. Her eyes stayed open, watching the middle distance. "Go ahead." He poured a thin stream of water from the canteen to flush the gash, working carefully along its length to clear the accumulated debris fragments of dirt and pine duff and dried blood that had begun to form a seal that was inadequate but present. She made no sound during this. He packed the cleaned wound with the sphagnum moss, pressing it gently into the channel of the laceration, where it would provide both compression and antiseptic benefit. Then placed the cloth compress over it and wrapped it twice around her head, with a length of thin cord from his jacket pocket, tying it snug enough to maintain pressure without restricting circulation. When he finished, she was watching him with a stillness that was different from the stillness of unconsciousness or pain management. It was the stillness of assessment. She had been watching him work, and she had been drawing conclusions from what she watched, the same way she had read the cabin and the men and the situation from her position of captivity. "You live out here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "For how long?" 2 years, 4 months, 11 days. She absorbed this. The fire between them was small, but its heat was disproportionate. The Dakota design concentrating the output in a narrow column that filled the low space with warmth that began to work on the cold she had accumulated over 12 hours in an unheated cabin. Outside, the rain was steady against the canopy. Inside, for the moment, there was warmth and concealment, and 2 people sitting in the dark across a small fire. "You don't know who I am," she said. "Should I?" She looked at the fire for a moment, then at him. "My name is Rain Callaway," she said, and her voice found a different register, steadier, the voice of someone stating a fact that has specific weight attached to it that requires a particular kind of deliberateness in the delivery. "My father is Dale Callaway. People call him Iron Halo. He's the president of the Hells Angels Oakland charter." The name landed the way names like that landed, not dramatically, not with any theatrical quality, but with the specific weight of a fact that reorganizes the context around it. Even 2 years removed from roads and towns and the ordinary circulation of information, Eli was not entirely ignorant of the world below the tree line. The towns in the valley, Covelo, Willits, Ukiah, whispered the name Callaway the way people whispered names they were genuinely afraid of. Not the affected fear of legend or reputation, the kind of fear that had entertainment value in its expression. The functional fear of a name that had actual consequences attached to it, that was connected to actual events and actual power in ways that made the fear a reasonable response to the information rather than a performance. Dale Callaway ran the most powerful motorcycle club in Northern California. The Oakland charter's reach extended well beyond Oakland. "The men who took you," Eli said, "Scorpions, a cartel-backed operation running meth through the Central Valley. They've been pushing against my father's territory for 2 years. Supply routes, distribution networks, the physical geography of how the product moves north." She delivered this without heat, factual, a briefing given by someone who had processed the information thoroughly enough that the emotional content had been separated from the operational content. "They took me off my bike on Highway 101 yesterday afternoon. 2 vehicles coordinated a clean intercept that required advanced knowledge of my route and timing." She paused. "They want to use me as leverage to force my father to hand over his supply routes and step back from 3 distribution territories." "And your father?" A brief, complicated expression moved through her face, not simple. It contained something that looked like love and something that looked like a very clear-eyed assessment of the person being loved, and those 2 things were not in conflict with each other. "My father doesn't negotiate, not with anyone, not under any circumstances. This is known. It is one of the fundamental operational principles of how he conducts business, and it is widely understood by anyone who has dealt with him." She looked at the fire. "The Scorpions knew this when they took me. which means the leverage play was never the real plan. The real plan was the thing after the leverage play fails. They were going to start sending him pieces of you, Eli said. Yes. The fire popped softly. Outside, the rain intensified, a gust of wind driving it against the root mass above their heads in a sound like distant applause. The belly held its warmth. You've been conscious for how much of the last 12 hours, Eli said. Intermittently. The first 2 hours I was unconscious. After that, varying periods. Enough. She looked at him with a directness that carried a specific quality of intention behind it. Enough to observe. They ran 2 patrols past the cabin in the time I was conscious. 3 men total in the patrol rotations, plus the 2 you saw. Harlan is the field commander. The man with him is named Remy. There's a higher authority they report to Briggs, who they communicate with by radio. Harlan has a radio on his belt. The lower cache they mentioned is approximately half a mile south-southwest down the slope where the old logging road branches. Eli looked at her. She had been concussed and bound and sitting in her own blood for 12 hours, and she had spent that time cataloging the operational structure of the people who had put her there. You said the intercept required advanced knowledge of your route, he said. Yes. Who knew your route? She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that preceded a conclusion someone had been approaching for hours and had not been ready to arrive at until this moment. 3 people, she said. My father, me. A pause that had weight in it. And Curtis Vane. Who is Curtis Vane? Vice President, my father's second in command for 4 years. He's been grooming Curtis for succession for the past 18 months, making introductions, bringing him into high-level operational decisions, positioning him as the future of the charter. She looked at the fire. Her jaw was tight in the specific way of someone controlling an emotional response that they have decided is not currently useful. Curtis has been pushing for an accelerated timeline. He wants my father to name a succession date to start the formal transition process. My father hasn't agreed. My father believes the transition happens when it happens, when he is certain the club is in the right hands, and he will not be pushed into a timeline by someone else's impatience. She paused. And Curtis knows because he has watched my father for 4 years, and he is not a stupid man that there is one thing that could change my father's operational calculus. One variable that, if removed, would destabilize everything. You, Eli said. Me. The name settled between them like a stone, dropping into deep water, the ripples of it spreading outward and touching everything. Then from outside the belly, from somewhere in the dark forest to the southwest, the sound reached them that Eli had been dreading since the moment he first pulled Rain to her feet. Not the truck engine, something worse. 2 distinct frequencies, high-pitched and mechanical and purposeful. The whine of 2-stroke dirt bike engines moving through undergrowth, working in the specific pattern of systematic search sweeping rather than tracking, covering ground methodically. And beneath the engines threading through the gaps in the rain noise, the sound that reached into a very old and non-negotiable part of the human nervous system and activated it without asking permission. Dogs. Not the sharp, excited barking of animals at play or at the sight of something new. Baying. The deep, resonant, rhythmic vocalization of large hounds with a scent acquired and nothing between them and the source of it. Eli kicked dirt over the fire in a single motion, plunging the belly into total darkness. In the dark, he felt Rain shift beside him, her shoulder finding his, her hand locating his forearm and gripping it. The grip was not panic. It was the grip of someone who had decided what outcome they were working toward and was communicating that decision through the only channel currently available. How many exits? She said. Her voice was completely level. 1. Then we go through it. A brief pause. What's the best route northeast from here? He was already at the entrance working his fingers through the briar sequence. Creek a quarter-mile northeast, deep, fast, cold. Kills the scent trail completely. Then that's where we're going. Rain! He stopped at the entrance. He could track the dogs with reasonable accuracy, now 2 of them working parallel lines through the undergrowth to the southwest. The bikes moving more slowly than the dogs following the hound handlers rather than leading the search. 200 yards, possibly less, the sound quality indicating they were making progress through the dense secondary growth. They have the tracker's last ping location. They'll reach this position within 15 to 20 minutes regardless of which direction we move. The dogs have bellies scent now. Once they acquire the trail from our exit point, the search collapses to a direct pursuit line. Then we need to be across the creek before they acquire the trail. She was already behind him at the entrance. Eli, you have been surviving alone in this forest for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days in conditions that would have killed most people in the first month. You know this ground in the dark. I know the people who are hunting us and how they think. A pause. Have you ever had anything hunting you before? No. Well, the smallest, darkest edge of something that wasn't quite humor but existed in the same territory. Now you do. Lead. He led. They came out through the briar wall into the cold dark and the rain moving northeast immediately. Eli in front with the knife in his hand and every piece of accumulated knowledge about this specific terrain arrayed before him like a map he had built with his own body over 2 years of daily contact with the ground. Rain half a step behind, quiet as the rain matching his pace with the steady, controlled movement of someone who had decided that keeping up was not optional and had organized everything available to her around that single requirement. The forest received them, and the hunt began. The northeast quarter of the Mendocino Forest at midnight was a different country from the one Eli had learned to inhabit in daylight. He knew this country, too, had walked it in darkness deliberately dozens of times, as training as the specific kind of preparation that required the condition it was preparing for you could not learn night navigation in the daytime, the way you could not learn cold by being warm. He had navigated these slopes and creek drainages in complete darkness, in rain, in the specific sensory deprivation of moonless nights under heavy cloud cover until the topography existed in his body as kinesthetic memory rather than visual recall. What he had never done was navigate it with a wounded person matching his stride with two-stroke engines and hunting hounds cutting systematic search patterns through the undergrowth behind them with a timeline that was not his own and could not be adjusted. He recalibrated everything he knew in the first 30 seconds of movement. Pace first. Fast enough to open and maintain distance, slow enough to prevent the kind of stumble that would cost critical time and potentially compromise Rain's already stressed system further. He chose his path based on 3 simultaneous calculations: ground firmness, overhead clearance, and the acoustic shadow provided by terrain features. A path that was optimal on any single criterion was often suboptimal on the others. The creek drainage to their northeast ran through a natural channel cut deep enough by decades of seasonal flow to drop their sound and scent profile below the ambient threshold. Getting into that channel was the mission. Everything else was in service of that. He could hear Rain behind him the way he heard the forest, not through any single obvious signal, but through the composite of small information. Her breathing controlled and deliberate 4-count rhythm she had established in the belly and was maintaining under movement load. This told him she was managing the head injury, actively monitoring her own cognitive state against the standard of what she had been before the injury, maintaining the breathing as a form of self-regulation. Her footfalls were lighter than her frame suggested, placing weight through the ball before committing the heel, a learned technique, rather than an instinctive one. The occasional soft compression of wet fern as she navigated around obstacles, she had identified herself without his guidance, reading the terrain ahead with the fraction of a second's processing time she had at their current pace. She was keeping up. More than keeping up. She was moving as a unit with him in the way that required intelligence and self-control in proportions that most people under these conditions could not have maintained. He thought briefly and without the luxury of extended reflection about what she had told him. She had been concussed and bound in a cold cabin for 12 hours. She had been bleeding the entire time, and she had spent that time cataloging patrol patterns and operational structure. She had identified the betrayal had arrived at Curtis Vane's name by logic rather than evidence, by eliminating the impossible and accepting what remained while managing severe physical distress. She processed the forest around her, now the same way she had processed the cabin, not as a hostile environment to be feared and endured, but as an information system to be read and used. He filed this away, not the habitual verbal shorthand, but the action itself, the process of taking information and placing it where it could be accessed quickly. He filed the specific profile of who Rain Callaway was, separate from who her father was, separate from what her situation was. He filed it because it was relevant and because the next several hours were going to require them to function as a unit, and understanding the specific capabilities of the person beside him was as important as understanding the terrain. Behind them, the dogs were still baying. He tracked the sound with mechanical precision. The hounds were working a wide sweep, The handlers were still in search mode rather than pursuit mode, which meant the belly's concealment had held better than he had expected. The briar wall was doing its work. The dogs hadn't yet acquired a clean exit trail. That would change. Rain's blood was in the belly, on the packed dirt floor, on the spent sphagnum moss in the air of the cavity itself. When the hounds reached the entrance, they would acquire a scent signature that was strong, recent, and directional, and the search pattern would collapse to a pursuit line within seconds. He had 8 minutes, possibly 10, before that happened. The creek was 6 minutes at current pace. He pushed the pace. They moved through a section of old growth where the trees were large enough that the canopy above blocked most of the rain, the understory dry and springy underfoot. Eli moved between the massive trunks in a serpentine path that minimized their silhouette and maximized their acoustic shadow, keeping larger trees between their line of movement and the direction of the search pattern. The old growth gave way to a steep bank where the drainage had undercut the hillside root systems, the soil loose and sandy, the slope covered in dead leaves. He turned to Rain and held up one finger, pointed down the bank, pointed to his feet, made a slow, deliberate stepping motion. She nodded once. He went down sideways, weight distributed, testing each step using exposed root systems as handholds. She followed with the same careful economy, no wasted motion, no grabbing at things she didn't need. The creek was there. A seasonal drainage channel 12 feet wide and running fast with accumulated rain. The water dark and opaque, carrying the mineral smell of moved earth. Thigh-deep in the center, he estimated. Cold in the specific way that mountain water in late November was cold. The kind of cold that registered not as temperature, but as immediate comprehensive pain, the kind that would begin compromising fine motor control within minutes if they stopped moving. He looked at Rain. She was already looking at the water. Her jaw was set with the expression of someone who had already decided to do something they knew was going to hurt and was past the deliberating stage. "How long?" she said. 10 minutes upstream. Takes us around the east side of the ridge away from the search pattern." The cold. "Keep moving continuously. If your legs go numb, tell me immediately." "They'll go numb. Tell me anyway." She stepped into the creek first. The sound she made was involuntary and brief, a sharp exhalation through clenched teeth, the sound of a body registering something it had not fully anticipated, despite knowing it was coming. He stepped in beside her and felt the cold arrive like a physical object, the water surging to mid-thigh, the temperature driving ice into his joints with an immediacy that overrode every other sensation. He set his teeth and began moving upstream, finding his footing on the irregular creek bed, keeping his steps deliberate against the current. The cold served a purpose. Within 30 seconds of immersion, it would kill the scent trail completely. The hounds would hit the bank and find nothing, their entire sensory narrative collapsing to silence, the handlers forced to grid search both banks until they reacquired. This would cost the pursuit significant time. 5 minutes, possibly 10. It was the only advantage the creek provided, and it came at a real cost to both of them, but it was a trade worth making. They moved upstream in silence. The rain on the water around them made a constant, soft percussion. The forest leaned over the channel from both sides, the canopy not quite meeting overhead, but close enough to break the worst of the rain. At 6 minutes, Rain stumbled. He caught her before she hit the water, one arm across her chest, pulling her back to vertical. Her weight against him was different from when she had stumbled in the undergrowth an hour earlier. She was leaning harder than the stumble itself required, her balance fundamentally compromised rather than simply interrupted. The cold was doing what the cold did to a body that was already managing a head injury and blood loss. It was reclaiming the ground that adrenaline had temporarily held. "Talk to me," he said close to her ear. "I'm here." Her voice was steady but thin. "Legs are gone from the knee down. I can feel pressure but not position. My feet are making decisions I can't verify." 3 minutes more. "I heard you." He shifted his position, taking more of her weight against his side, his arm behind her back. They covered the remaining distance with his body, partially substituting for what her legs could no longer reliably provide his pace, adapting to what she could actually do, rather than what the situation wanted. He pulled her out of the water onto a rocky embankment. They stood for a moment, both dripping steam rising from their wet clothing in the cold air. The baying of the hounds was there, distant now, coming from the southwest. The sound quality less directional, indicating the handlers were working expanding arcs around the dead zone where the scent trail had entered the water. The creek had bought them time. Eli took Rain's hands and worked her fingers systematically pressing and releasing, forcing circulation back through the joints. She didn't speak. Her hands were a pale gray-white, and she was shaking in the deep muscle way that indicated her core temperature had dropped past the comfortable margin. But she was upright and her eyes were tracking, and she was watching him work on her hands with the same focused attention she brought to everything, monitoring her own recovery, the way a clinician monitors a patient. "Better," she said finally. She pulled her hands back and made fists, opened them, made fists again. "Thank you." He turned his attention to the embankment above them and the ridgeline beyond it. They had one overriding advantage, and it was his. He knew this ground in a way that no one on those bikes or holding those leashes could possibly know it. The Scorpions had a GPS signal that had gone dark and a sector designation in dogs that were currently working blind. They had numbers and weapons and communication. But they were navigating terrain they had entered from the outside using information that was necessarily incomplete, making decisions based on what maps and GPS coordinates told them rather than what the ground actually contained. Eli was the terrain. He had been the terrain for 2 years, and the terrain was his. He chose their route carefully up and over the eastern face of the ridge rather than around it, harder ground, but the only approach that would position them on the far side of the watershed from the search pattern. Before the East Ridge, however, was a natural choke point. They had to pass a narrow gap between two massive boulder formations, a 3-foot wide passage between vertical stone faces where the embankment narrowed to its minimum width. No practical alternate route without adding 20 minutes they didn't have. He stopped at the gap, reached into his jacket pocket. The snare wire, high tensile steel rated for 60 pounds, thin enough to be nearly invisible against dark stone. He had 30 feet of it wound in a flat coil. He crossed the gap to the far side, played the wire back through it, threaded the end around a natural horn of stone at precisely the right height. Not neck height for a person on foot. Neck height for a person seated on a dirt bike traveling at the speed a dirt bike would achieve on the approach to this gap. The only gap in the boulders, the only line a bike would naturally take through here. He pulled the wire taut, tested the tension against the stone anchor, wound the remaining length twice around a root that had forced itself through a crack in the boulder face. The steel was the color of the wet stone in the darkness. It was not visible unless you were already looking for it and knew exactly what you were looking for. He went back through to Rain. "Right side is occupied. Come through on the left." She looked at the gap, processed his instruction, moved through the left side with complete confidence in the information she'd been given. On the far side they climbed. The east face of the ridge was steep and wet, the clay-heavy soil slick under any significant rainfall. They went up on hands and feet in sections, fingers digging into root systems for purchase arms, doing work that the legs couldn't accomplish against the wet grade. Rain climbed without complaint and without asking for anything beyond what her body absolutely required. 2 sections where the grade was too steep, he reached back and she took his hand, and she was pulled over each without a word. They were 2/3 up the face when the sound reached them from below. The motorcycle had been moving fast, committed to the line, the rider confident in pursuit rather than alert to being set against. The wire caught at throat height with the full kinetic weight of the bike's forward velocity. The sound was not something Eli would have chosen to produce if he'd had other options. A violent, complex, metallic impact, the engine immediately going to full throttle as the rider's mass left the seat, the bike continuing forward, unguided, and striking the boulder face at speed, the engine screaming for 3 seconds before it died. Then a sustained sound from the far side of the gap. Rain was climbing and did not stop climbing. He matched her pace. At the ridge crest they went flat and looked back down the slope. Tactical flashlights were sweeping the undergrowth near the creek bank, moving fast and without pattern, urgency displacing method. A second light appeared 30 yards south, moving parallel. The handlers had heard the crash and pulled out of their search pattern. The dogs had gone silent, either pulled in tight by their handlers or something else. Eli and Rain came down the northeast face into older growth trees, massive and widely spaced. The floor a deep carpet of old needles that absorbed both sound and footfall. He could feel her moving differently now, still upright, still functional, still forward, but with the specific quality of movement that indicated the body was operating closer to its actual limits and further from the performance of having reserves in hand. A quarter mile down the northeast slope, he found the 3 boulders, a geological formation where 3 large masses had come to rest against each other over time, creating a cavity beneath them that was naturally sheltered from above and invisible beyond about 15 feet. The ground approaching it from every direction was solid exposed granite that left no scent trail and no impression. He brought Rain in. They sat with their backs against the stone shoulders touching. He built a fire no larger than his hand in the rocky depression. Beside them, a second piece of lint from his inner pocket, a second set of matches kept on his person precisely for circumstances where the primary kit was unavailable. The stone above them absorbed the heat and reflected it back down. In 5 minutes, the space was measurably warmer. Rain said nothing for several minutes. She sat with her knees drawn up, working her hands together steadily, watching the fire with an expression he had learned in the past hour to recognize as her processing expression. Jaw slightly forward, eyes focused on the middle distance rather than the immediate working, through something with the disciplined thoroughness of someone who had been trained to think under pressure and was now applying that training at the limits of physical endurance. Then she said, "The wire at the gap." "Yes." "You set that while I was crossing." "Yes." "You had it in your pocket." "I carry wire for snares." She looked at him with a clarity that was remarkable given everything her system was currently managing. "You've been alone out here for 2 years. You didn't panic when you found me. You didn't freeze at the cabin at the creek on the ridge face. You made decisions at a speed I've been trained to achieve, and you made them from knowledge I don't have access to." She paused. "How old are you?" 17. Something moved through her expression, a brief disruption of the controlled surface before it settled back. She understood what 17 meant in this context. It meant he had been 15 when he came into this forest alone, and 15 when he had built everything she had seen him use tonight. "You said high-stress environments your whole life," he said. "My father's club is not a social organization. I grew up understanding certain realities about how things work outside normal systems, how violence functions as a tool and a deterrent, how loyalty works when the stakes are real, how people behave when the structures they depend on get removed." She looked at the fire. "I've been prepared theoretically for exactly the kind of situation we're currently in. The theory of it, the planning for it, the intellectual understanding of what it requires." A pause. "You're better at the practice." Significantly. He took the radio from inside his jacket where he had been keeping it against his body to preserve the battery in the cold. A Motorola commercial-grade handheld, the kind used by organized operations and security personnel. The volume had been all the way down since Rain took it from the handler's vest. He turned it up just enough to hear output without projecting outward. Static. Then a transmission. The voice was calm in the specific way that controlled anger sounded when the person had extensive practice at the control. "Sector 4 is compromised. Harlan, pull back to the ridge road and reset. Talk to me." A different voice, rougher with the breathless quality of exertion and something underneath the exertion. "Harlan's at the gap, he's down. Remy's with him, he'll need the truck for transport." A pause with effort in it. "Kids are over the east ridge. We had visual at the crest approximately 22 minutes ago. Movement northeast toward the gorge." The first voice. "Good. The gorge is the terminus. North face is 200 feet of vertical basalt into the eel. Nothing usable on the south approach either. It's open rock all the way to the rim. Get everyone to the ridge road and drive northeast. Come in from the east, push them to the edge. We finish this before light." A longer pause. "And I need someone to tell me the Oakland charter is not as close as the spotter on 101 is reporting." Static. Then Briggs, spotter says 300 bikes at the 101-162 interchange. Moving north. Briggs. The voice was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. 40 minutes, we have 40 minutes, move everyone now." The transmission cut. Eli reduced the volume to 0. 300 bikes at the 101-162 interchange. 20 miles south. 40 minutes was a generous estimate for 300 motorcycles traveling together at highway speed. The actual number was likely closer to 30, accounting for the time that had already passed since the transmission. He looked at Rain. She was staring at the radio with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not the controlled processing expression, not the managed presentation of functional capacity. Something beneath the surface of all of that. Something older and less trained. The specific expression of a person who has just had a deep fear. Confirmed the fear they had been doing their most sophisticated cognitive work to avoid confirming. "Someone tipped them off," she said. Her voice was level, but the levelness was costing her. "Your father is coming. Someone gave my father a specific approach vector. The 101 to 162 interchange is exactly right for this section of the forest. That's not a general direction. That's a precise routing decision made by someone who knew exactly where I was. She turned to look at him, and her voice was under control, but the thing beneath the control was moving, was pressing against the containment. Only 3 people knew my route. My father, me, Curtis Vane. Curtis would have told Briggs to clean this up immediately if he'd learned your father was mobilizing. Yes, unless... She stopped. A long silence in which something worked itself through to a conclusion. Unless someone in my father's circle figured out the Curtis connection independently. A member who knew Curtis had been pushing for timeline acceleration, who put together the access plus the motive and reached out through a back channel. She shook her head. It doesn't matter right now. What matters is that my father is 20 miles south with 300 bikes and Briggs is compressing his timeline to 40 minutes and the gorge is exactly where they want us. Are we heading toward the gorge? Eli said. The Eel River Gorge. He knew it, a massive geological rupture in the landscape. The river 200 feet below the rim, the north face sheer basalt that provided nothing in the way of descent. The terrain on the south and east approaches funneled naturally toward the rim, the way water funneled toward a drain, the forest giving way to open rock with no cover. It was a box. If we continue northeast on this bearing, he said. Yes, the gorge is the natural terminus of this route. The terrain geometry makes it close to inevitable unless you know specific deviations. He looked at the rock ceiling above them. I know one deviation. Then take it. It adds 40 minutes and requires traversing a rock face that is 18 inches wide in places. With your head injury and your current temperature. Eli, she said his name with a precision that cut the sentence off cleanly. If we go northeast and reach the gorge, we are dead in the next 40 minutes. If we take your route, we are possibly not. She held his gaze with the full force of that direct attention. Take the route. He took the route. They moved southeast first, which felt wrong toward the pursuit rather than away, but southeast was the only access to a traverse line Eli had discovered 8 months earlier, while mapping the secondary drainage system in this sector. A narrow geological shelf along the face of a basalt intrusion at mid-slope, connecting the northeast drainage to the Western Ridge Road approach by a route that appeared on no map, because the maps had been produced by people who mapped trails and roads, not geological features that were inaccessible to anyone who didn't already know they existed. The shelf was 18 inches wide in its narrowest section. Rain looked at it from the entry point for 1 second without expression. Then she moved on to it. They traversed in single file, Eli first, Rain with her right hand against the rock face and her left extended for balance over a 40-foot drop to the boulder field below. The rain had eased slightly, which helped visibility on the shelf, though the surface itself was wet and required each step to be placed and tested before weight was committed. They moved slowly. This section did not permit anything else. Midway across the sound below stopped them both. A dirt bike on the slope beneath the shelf headlight sweeping up the rock face in a methodical search pattern. The beam tracked upward. If it reached the shelf level, it would illuminate them completely against the wet stone. The beam stopped 12 feet below them. The slight overhang of the rock face at that point blocked the light's angle. They were invisible. The bike swept south and disappeared. Eli counted 60 seconds in his head, then moved. Rain moved with him, her hand steady against the stone, her balance precise. At the far end of the traverse, the shelf widened back to walkable ground, and the basalt gave way to old-growth forest. They stepped off the rock and back into the trees. Eli became aware that his hands were shaking, not from cold. He pressed his palm flat against the bark of the nearest tree and held it there for a moment, using the contact to ground the sensation. He was 17 years old, and he had not slept, and he had been in sustained high-intensity fear state for several hours, and the specific reserves that fear state consumed were not bottomless. He was aware of this the way he was aware of everything that was happening to his body without judgment as information. He noted it and set it aside. You stopped, Rain said close behind him. Recalibrating. A brief pause. How far to the gorge? Half-mile northeast from here. Then we need to move. She looked northeast through the trees. Briggs' 40 minutes started at least 20 minutes ago. He gave her the radio without being asked. She had already reached for it. She held it without turning up the volume, turning it end over end in her hands. She had the processing expression, but there was something different in it now. Not a conclusion being reached, but a decision being finalized. The expression of someone who has completed the analysis and is committing to the action at the end of it. Curtis Vane is sitting on a bike somewhere on that highway, she said in the middle of my father's entire charter. He thinks I'm dead. He thinks Briggs cleaned it up hours ago and the evidence is gone and the situation is resolved in his favor. He rode with the club because not riding would have been evidence. He's been managing his expression and his behavior for 20 miles, managing the performance of grief and anger that a vice president is supposed to display when the president's daughter has been taken. She paused. And Briggs knows that if my father reaches this forest, every single person Briggs brought here tonight dies. So Briggs is pushing hard and pushing reckless, and when people push reckless, they commit to lines that become predictable. She looked at the radio. I want to make him more scared. Rain, if you transmit, they get our location. They have our location. They know we're northeast of the ridge and moving toward the gorge. The detail I'm going to give them is not a location, it's a problem. She hit transmit before he could complete the objection. Her voice, when it came out of her, had a quality he had not heard before. Every other version of her voice had been controlled, measured the output of someone managing what they put into the world carefully. This was different. This was fully charged, fully present, every available resource pointed in one direction. Briggs, this is Rain Callaway. I'm alive, I'm mobile, and I'm coming out of your forest. And when my father finds out that Curtis Vane arranged this, there will not be enough left of either of you to identify. She released the transmit, set the radio against the rock at her feet, and brought a heavy stone down on it with both hands. The casing shattered, the electronics scattered across the wet stone. Eli stared at the broken pieces. You just told them exactly where we are. They already knew where we are. She straightened and met his eyes. The pallor was still there, and the bandage was still there, and the gray exhaustion was still there, but her eyes were completely steady. But now Briggs is also wondering if Curtis is going to try to reach my father before we do. Now Curtis is wondering what Briggs is going to do with that transmission. And men who are wondering about each other rather than about a target make mistakes. She turned northeast. You manage the forest, I'll manage the people. We work with what we have. He looked at her. At the blood on her jacket and the makeshift bandage and the gray pallor of a body running significantly below its maintenance level. At the absolute stillness of her posture and the precision of what she had just done, turning a crisis into a two-front problem for their pursuers in the time it took most people to decide whether to run or freeze. He turned northeast and began moving. They covered the half-mile to the gorge rim in 20 minutes, the terrain rising and then dropping sharply toward the edge, the forest thinning as the soil became thinner and the rock closer to the surface. The sound of the Eel River 200 feet below was audible before they saw the rim, a deep, constant rushing sound that rose from the darkness beneath like the respiration of something large and alive, and entirely indifferent to what happened on the rim above it. They came to the edge. The gorge opened before them in the dark, a vast, absolute emptiness. The far wall was visible only as a denser darkness against the darkness of the night sky, a negative space that registered as much by its absence of rain noise as by any positive visual information. Below 200 feet down, the river moved. There was nowhere further to go. Eli turned his back to the gorge and faced the forest. Rain stood beside him. They were both soaked through and cold and bleeding, and standing at the lip of a 200-foot drop with the dark forest in front of them. The lights came through the trees, 5 of them, tactical flashlights sweeping the forest floor, moving in a dispersed line. A deliberate drive formation, men positioned to cover both escape routes, advancing toward the rim with the unhurried confidence of people who knew with certainty that there was nowhere left to go. Harlan Briggs came through the trees first. He was limping on his right leg now. Something had happened at the gap beyond what his voice on the radio had indicated. And he held the pump-action shotgun at low ready, not slung, not casual. His scar caught the beam of his own tactical light in a way that made the healed tissue look like a seam in something that had been broken and put back together without proper materials. Behind him, 4 other men spread across a 40-yard front and materialized from the dark in the specific way that armed men in darkness materialized, appearing as resolved shapes where there had been only varying degrees of shadow. The hounds were back on their leashes, lunging against the restraint with the agitation of animals that had the scent strong in their nostrils and nothing between them and it except the handler's grip. Briggs stopped 15 yards out. His flashlight found Eli's face and held there, then moved to Rain. A long moment in which no one spoke and the river below provided the only sound. "End of the line," Briggs said. The same managed calm, the same controlled anger below the calm, present enough to hear. He looked at Rain with the expression of someone completing an administrative task, a man checking a box rather than experiencing an outcome. "You've caused a significant amount of trouble tonight." He pumped the shotgun. The sound of the action cycling, the specific metallic deliberate sound of a shell being chambered, was unnaturally loud over the sound of the river below and the rain above and everything else that was happening in that clearing. Then he turned his attention to Eli, and something changed in his expression. Something that was closer to genuine feeling than anything he had shown before. The specific irritation of a professional who has been made to work much harder than the situation should have required. "And you?" He looked at Eli the way you looked at something that had caused you significant damage without having any right to. "You cost me a man at the Gap. I have a second man with a knee that will never work correctly again. For a 17-year-old boy living in a hole in the ground, that's—" He paused. "That's an impressive accounting. I'll give you that much." He raised the barrel of the shotgun until it was centered on Eli's chest. "It doesn't change what comes next." Eli said nothing. He was standing in front of Rain, which was not a decision he had consciously made, and not something he was able to change now that it had happened. The knife was in his hand. His hand was not steady. He was aware of this without being able to correct it. The specific tremor of a body that had been running at maximum output for hours and was reaching a limit that willpower could not fully address. He was 17 years old, and he had a knife, and 5 armed men were arranged in a half circle between him and the forest, with a 200-foot drop behind him, and there was no calculation in any version of the available mathematics that made the knife a relevant variable in the outcome. He held it anyway. Briggs settled his weight. The barrel didn't waver. His finger found the trigger guard with the practiced ease of a man who had been here before in some version or another and had never been on the losing side of it. And then the ground began to move. Not seismically, not randomly. A rhythmic vibration that came up through the soles of their boots and through the rock and into everything in contact with the earth. A frequency that existed below the normal threshold of sound. Something the body registered as a physical fact before the mind had assembled sufficient information to identify it. Small stones near the gorge rim trembled. Loose soil shifted and began its slow migration toward the drop. Briggs lowered the barrel fractionally. His head turned left toward the ridge road running along the high ground to the west. Eli heard it a second later. Not one engine, not 10. A sound that was to individual engine noise what an ocean is to a cup of water. Something that was not happening within the environment, but was happening to it. A total environmental fact that subsumed the rain and the river and the wind and replaced them all with a mechanical thunder that climbed in volume with the consistency of something that was not slowing and was not small. Light crested the western ridge. Not one beam, not 10. A continuous, unbroken wall of white LED light stretching along the ridge crest for hundreds of yards in both directions, the individual sources indistinguishable at this distance, the aggregate producing a brightness that turned the falling rain above the ridgeline to silver. A curtain of light that was visible from the gorge rim the way a city is visible from distance. Briggs stood completely still. His men stood completely still. The dog sat down. From the center of that wall of light, a single motorcycle separated from the mass and came down the slope, not on the ridge road, but directly down the forested grade engine at full power. Headlight driving through rain and dark and trees with the specific absolute indifference of something that has already decided the obstacles are irrelevant to its movement and has organized itself accordingly. Dale Callaway's bike came to a stop 10 yards from Harlan Briggs in a spray of mud and wet pine needles, and the specific sound of a heavily loaded motorcycle performing an emergency stop on loose, wet ground. The engine cut. In the partial silence that followed the sound of the engines idling on the ridge above was a physical pressure in the chest, a wall of mechanical intention that pressed against everything in the clearing. Dale Callaway put down the kickstand and stepped off the bike. He was large in the way that very few people were large, not just in physical dimension, but in the way that presence operated in a space, the specific gravity of someone who had spent decades making decisions that other people had to live with and whose body had organized itself around that fact. He wore a soaked leather cut over a vest that had considerably more structural integrity than leather, and the death head insignia on his back caught the light from the ridge above and held it. His right hand carried a modified AR-15 at low carry, not raised, not aimed, simply present, the way a tool was present in the hand of someone who had been using tools professionally for a very long time. He did not say anything. He did not look at Briggs. He looked at Rain. Behind him on the slope between the ridgeline and the gorge, boots hit the ground. Not all at once. Continuously, a sustained rolling sound like the leading edge of a very slow, very deliberate wave. 281 men in leather and denim descended the forested slope in the dark, and the rain moving with the specific unhurried coordination of people who have done this before and will do it again and feel nothing about it except the clarity of knowing exactly what they are doing and why. They moved in silence. This was the thing that registered most forcefully, not the numbers, not the weapons, but the silence. The massive, organized, purposeful silence of an operation that had reached its final phase. The 5 scorpions were inside a circle before any of them had fully processed what was forming around them. Eli stood at the gorge rim with his knife in his hand and watched it happen. His hand had stopped shaking. Harlan Briggs dropped his shotgun. Not with ceremony, not with any deliberate quality of surrender or statement. The weapon left his hands the way an object leaves the hands of someone who has lost the neurological intention to hold it. It simply fell, and the mud received it with a flat, wet sound. And the tactical light still mounted to the barrel sent its beam straight up into the rain, illuminating a useless column of silver water above the clearing. His 4 men followed within seconds. 6 weapons, finding the mud in a cluster of overlapping sounds, the dogs released from their leashes by handlers who had absorbed the situation with the speed of professional self-preservation, the animals sitting down in the wet ground as their purpose dissolved. In the same moment, everything else dissolved. The circle of angels was not loud. This was the thing that Eli had not anticipated and that registered with a specific force through the particular clarity that sustained extreme exhaustion produced. He had expected volume. The thunder of the approach had suggested it. The sheer mass of men descending the slope had suggested it. But the circle formed in near silence, boots, finding purchase in wet ground, the steady idling of 300 engines on the ridge above, providing the only sustained sound, and that silence was more complete and more final than any noise could have been. Dale Callaway walked across the clearing. He moved with the directional certainty of a man who had, for this moment, reduced the entire situation to a single coordinate. Everything else existed in his peripheral awareness as managed information. The 5 disarmed scorpions, the rain, the gorge, the assembled club on the slope behind him, all of it managed, all of it already handled or in the process of being handled. The single coordinate was his daughter. Rain took 3 steps forward, and then her legs made the decision that her will had been overriding for the past 3 hours, and she went down to one knee. She caught herself on her hands, head dropping the accumulated debt of 12 hours of head injury and blood loss, and sustained movement through freezing water, arriving all at once in the way that deferred physical consequences always arrived. Dale covered the remaining distance in 2 strides and came to his knees in the mud beside her. He was a large man made larger by his cut and the vest beneath it, and when he put his arms around his daughter, the size differential was stark. Rain's leather jacket and the whole of her disappearing into the embrace, her blood-matted hair against his neck. The clearing held its breath. Dale's shoulders moved once. One single contraction immediately and completely suppressed, visible only to someone standing close enough in the right direction, with the specific attention of someone who had been reading subtle physical information for years as a survival skill. A man who had spent decades constructing and maintaining the architecture of fear that a name like Iron Halo required could not dismantle that architecture publicly in a clearing with 281 witnesses without consequences that extended well beyond this moment. But the architecture had a seam in it, and the seam ran directly through the girl in his arms, and for one moment the seam was visible. Then Dale Callaway got hold of himself and the seam closed, and what remained was simply a man holding his daughter in the mud, in the rain, with complete and total attention, all other considerations suspended. "I've got you," he said. His voice was low, directed only at her. "You're out. I've got you." Rain's hands worked in the leather of his vest, gripping with the intensity of someone who has been telling themselves for hours that this exact moment would come, and is now having to process the reality of it against the expectation. Her fingers found the specific positions that years of this embrace had established. "Dad?" Her voice was compressed by the embrace and by something else. "Curtis." Dale went still. It was a different stillness from his previous stillness. Previous stillness had been focus. This was the stillness that preceded a specific category of decision, the moment before commitment, that Eli had seen in Predators, the moment when the calculation was complete and the action was about to begin. Dale pulled back enough to see her face. His hands came up and held her face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything else about him. Thumbs moving carefully along her cheekbones, clearing blood and rain, reading the makeshift bandage, assessing the pallor. "Tell me," he said. "My route. Only 3 people knew it. He put the tracker in my boot lining before I left the house. He'd already made the arrangement with Briggs." She held her father's eyes. "It was always Curtis. He wanted you to give him a succession timeline, and you wouldn't, and he decided to remove the reason you wouldn't. He had it planned. The intercept was too clean for anything else." Dale looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked left. The man standing there was indistinguishable from the other angels in the outer ring of the circle, except by his patches. The name patch read Cutter. The rank patch designated Sergeant-at-Arms. He had a jaw that functioned like load-bearing architecture and hands that looked as though they had been designed for a different, larger frame and fitted to a human one as a practical compromise. Dale held Cutter's gaze for approximately 1 second. Cutter turned and moved through the ring of men without speaking. The sound that came from the second rank of the assembled club, 30 seconds later, was not violent in the way that the night's earlier violence had been violent. It was brief and purposeful, the sound of a situation being concluded. And then Curtis Vane was being moved through the circle, 2 large hands on the collar of his riding boots dragging twin parallel furrows in the wet mud. Curtis Vane was a man in his mid-40s who had, until approximately this moment, understood himself to be a patient and intelligent person who had made a correct calculation. He was lean, maintained, with a face that in other contexts projected trustworthiness, the kind of open-lined face that came from outdoor work and real laughter and years of genuine human connection. He had ridden with Dale Callaway for 11 years. He had stood at Rain's 16th birthday dinner and given a toast that people had talked about afterward for its warmth. He had stood at a club ceremony 18 months ago and delivered a speech about loyalty and brotherhood that members still quoted. He was deposited in the mud 5 feet from Dale Callaway, and he did not struggle because Curtis Vane was intelligent enough to understand that struggling was not a category of action available to him in this clearing with this assembly of witnesses, and that the only remaining resource he possessed was his intelligence, and struggling would spend that resource immediately without return. He looked at Rain. Something moved through his expression that existed in the territory between guilt and defiance without fully occupying either the expression of a person who has made a very large bet, watched it lose, and is now doing the arithmetic on what comes next. "You're alive," he said. His voice cost him something, maintaining its levelness. "I know," Rain said. She was standing. She had gotten herself upright when Dale rose, and she was standing with her weight properly distributed and her spine straight, in a way that required active effort and that she was clearly choosing to make. Dale had one hand lightly at her back, present, not supporting, simply present. "The tracker," Curtis said. "A 17-year-old boy found it in 30 seconds, Rain said. "He found it because he was paying attention and because he had nothing invested in not finding it." She held Curtis's gaze with the same quality of attention she brought to everything direct, undecorated, not performing anything for the benefit of the audience around her. "You placed it in the boot lining before I left the house. You told Briggs my route and timing. You arranged the intercept location on 101. A pause. "You planned it the month after my father told you again that he wasn't ready to name a succession date. You decided that removing the reason for his hesitation was more efficient than continuing to wait." Curtis looked at Dale. The calculation in his eyes ran to its conclusion. "The club needed a decision, Dale. You kept deferring. The transition couldn't wait indefinitely while you—" "Cutter," Dale said. At normal conversational volume. Not raised, not dramatic. The tone of a man giving a routine instruction in a context where routine instructions had very specific consequences. Curtis Vane looked around him. He looked at the circle of 281 faces, and not one of them turned away, and not one of them offered any expression that could be read as ambiguity. He had given a speech about loyalty that people still quoted, and the audience for that speech was assembled in a circle around him, in the mud and the rain, and every face in it was the same. He looked at Rain one more time. Something in his expression shifted, not apology, not contrition exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has just fully understood the dimensions of what he chose to do and what it cost. "I built half of what this club has," he said. 11 years. Rain said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was not angry. It was something that landed with more weight than anger. "I know," she said. "That's why it took my father so long to see it." Dale looked at Cutter. Cutter moved. Curtis Vane was walked back through the ring. The ring closed behind him. Whatever happened after that happened outside Eli's sightline, and with a quietness that was its own complete statement about how things were resolved when the audience had already decided. Eli stood at the gorge rim with his knife in his hand. He had not moved from the rim. His boots were in 3 inches of mud at the point where the cleared ground gave way to the rocky approach to the drop, and the Eel River 200 feet below was a constant, indifferent background note to everything happening in the clearing. The cold had worked its way fully into his joints, settling into the hips and shoulders with the specific weighted quality of exhaustion that didn't respond to willpower the way acute exhaustion did. His left arm, where the dog had clamped down at the creek bank, had stiffened through the course of the night's activity. He registered this now in the way he registered everything that had not been immediately actionable during the night as information that could finally be attended to. He looked at the knife in his hand, at the worn paracord handle, at the slight concavity in the blade that 2 years of careful sharpening had produced. He looked at it with the attention of someone examining a thing that has served its function completely and is now waiting to understand what comes next. He became aware that the clearing had oriented toward him. Not overtly, not all at once. In the way that attention in a group moved, a gradual rotation, a settling of the ambient sound, a change in the quality of the clearing's collective attention as a new focal point established itself. Men who had been managing the aftermath of the operation began to look in his direction, and then more of them. And then the clearing, which held 281 men, and the disarmed scorpions, and the mud and the rain, and the sound of the river was arranged around him in a way that he did not understand and could not account for. Dale Callaway crossed the clearing toward him. Up close, the scale of the man was different from what distance had suggested. Not just physical, the 6.5 feet of maintained functional mass, the Kevlar-reinforced vest under the soaked cut, but the specific gravity of someone who had spent decades making decisions that other people had to live with afterward. A working face lined by weather and responsibility, the kind of face that carries the marks of sustained consequence. The eyes were the same color as Rain's, the same quality of attention in them. Dale stopped in front of Eli. He looked at the makeshift moss bandage on Eli's left arm, the vine used to tie it still green and wet from the forest floor. He looked at the dog bite visible where the canvas jacket had torn the bruising already dark against the pale skin of the forearm. He looked at the mud that had worked its way into every crease and fold of the canvas jacket, at the snare wire, still visible in the right jacket pocket, at the way Eli was standing, weight forward on the balls of his feet, body half turned, the posture of someone who has been in sustained readiness for hours and has not yet received the neurological signal that it is safe to stand any differently. He looked at the knife. He looked at Eli's face. "What is your name, son?" Dale Callaway said. The word son did something to the air between them. Eli processed it carefully. It was the kind of word that large older men used as a general address, a habit, a filler, a convention of the context. It didn't mean what it would mean if someone had chosen it deliberately. He told himself this. "Eli Voss," he said. Dale nodded slowly. He looked back at Rain, who had moved to stand at the edge of the clearing with her arms wrapped around her ribs watching. He looked at the bandage on her head, at the specific material, the sphagnum moss visible at the edges of the cloth, the vine wrap binding the torn hem of a shirt that was no longer attached to the shirt that Eli was wearing. He looked at the gorge rim, at the position Eli was standing in relative to where Briggs had been standing with the shotgun. Dale Callaway turned back to Eli with the expression of a man who has done a specific piece of arithmetic and arrived at a result that has only one possible meaning. "You've been out here alone," Dale said. Statement, not question. "How long?" 2 years, 4 months, 11 days. The number produced something in Dale's expression that Eli had enough experience with pity to identify as something other than pity. It was recognition. The specific recognition of someone who understood what it meant to build something alone in conditions that were not designed to support building and to have built it anyway. "You found her in that cabin," Dale said. "Yes." "You brought her through this forest, in this weather, at night, with Briggs's people and his dogs behind you?" "Yes." "You are 17 years old." There was nothing to add to this. Dale looked at him for a long moment. The rain fell on both of them with the complete indifference that rain brought to everything. Somewhere in the second rank of the assembled club, a man coughed once, and then was silent. The engines on the ridge continued their low collective respiration. Then Dale Callaway stepped back. He did not do it quickly. He did not perform it for an audience, though the audience was present. He simply stepped back, and then he lowered himself to one knee in the mud, his right knee finding the wet ground with the controlled deliberateness of a large man who has decided to do something and has considered its meaning before doing it. He brought his head down, not prostrate, not theatrical, the specific inclination of someone paying respect to something they have assessed and found unambiguously worthy of it. Eli did not move. From his left, Cutter stepped forward. He looked at Eli for 1 second with eyes that contained everything and gave away nothing. Then he went to one knee beside Dale. The man to Cutter's left went to one knee. And the man to his left. And then it moved, not slowly, not with drama, but with the inevitability of a wave built over deep water that has finally reached the shore and has no option left but to break. From the center outward, from the inner ring to the outer ring, from the men in the clearing to the men on the slope above it, 281 members of the Oakland Charter of the Hells Angels of America knelt in the mud in the rain of the Mendocino National Forest in the dark, before a 17-year-old boy with a worn hunting knife and a torn canvas jacket and 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days of accumulated nothing. The silence was the loudest thing Eli Voss had ever heard. He stood in it, and he did not look away. He understood in the same instant that there was nothing to do with this moment. No response it required, no skill he had developed that was applicable to it. This was simply a moment, and it was happening to him, and the only thing required was to be present in it without looking away from what it was. He looked at Rain. She was standing at the edge of the cleared ground with her arms still wrapped around her own ribs, and her blood-matted hair against her neck, and the makeshift bandage on her head, and her leather jacket dark with rain. She was looking at him with the watchful steadiness that she had carried through every moment of this night, not the managed presentation of functional capacity, but something underneath that, something that had been there in the cabin when she first looked up at him, something that had looked at him across a dirt floor in the light of a Dakota fire and decided in about 3 seconds that he was worth trusting. The thing beneath the steadiness was visible now. Not relief or satisfaction or any of the clean, completed emotions that a simpler version of this story might have provided. Something more complicated than any of those things. The expression of a person who understands that something has happened that will take years to fully understand. She nodded at him once. He nodded back. Dale rose from the mud. His men rose with him, the reversal happening in the same wave pattern as the original 281 men coming back to their feet in the cold and the rain. He crossed back to Eli and stopped close enough that the rain was no longer the dominant sound between them. "You don't live in these woods anymore," Dale said. Not a command, not a request. A geographic fact stated in the tone of someone who does not experience the alternative as a realistic category. "You come with us. You belong to the club now." Eli looked at him. He looked at the death head patch on Dale's cut water darkened, and present the way it had been present in whispers and warnings for as long as he had been aware of the world below the tree line. He looked at the ridge above them where 300 headlights still burned against the rain. He looked at the forest around them, the forest that had taken him in when nothing else would, that had asked nothing from him except his complete attention and his willingness to learn what it had to teach, that had been honest with him in the way that nothing else in his life had been honest with him. He thought about the young pine near his primary shelter. About 729 marks in the bark, scratched in groups of 5, each one a day. The discipline of it. The loneliness of it. Not the screaming loneliness of the newly isolated, but the deep, settled loneliness of someone who has been alone long enough that it has ceased to feel like a condition and begun to feel like a characteristic. The loneliness that stops presenting as a wound and starts presenting as weather. He thought about what it would mean for the weather to change. "Okay," he said. Dale extended his hand. Eli took it. The grip was complete and deliberate, the kind that meant something specific in the context in which it was given, and both parties knew it. Dale turned to the practical management of the clearing. The Scorpions were bound with their own zip ties and moved to the Ridge Road with an efficiency that indicated this was not the first time the Oakland Charter had managed aftermath in difficult terrain. Harlan Briggs separated from his shotgun, and his operational context was a smaller man than he had been 40 minutes ago. The managed calm consumed entirely by what it had been managing, leaving something underneath it that looked very much like a man reassessing every calculation he had ever made about how situations could develop. He said nothing as he was walked up the slope. Rain was examined by a man Eli later learned was Dr. Garth Sully, former military trauma surgeon, 20 years riding with the charter medical kit in his saddlebag that would not have been out of place in a forward operating base. Dr. Sully cleaned and properly closed the gash on her head with the flat professional efficiency of someone for whom this was simply technical work requiring accurate execution, checked her pupils and her blood pressure and her temperature, and told her in a voice that contained no cushioning that she had a grade 2 concussion, mild hypothermia, and that she needed to be in a hospital within 3 hours. Rain told him she would be in a hospital within 3 hours. Dr. Sully said good and moved directly to Eli. The dog bite was deep at 3 points, and the bruising covered the full circumference of the forearm. Dr. Sully cleaned it with the specific kind of thoroughness that felt punitive and was simply professional, sutured the deepest puncture with materials from his kit, wrapped the arm with a compression bandage, and told Eli he would need a full course of antibiotics within 24 hours. "What's your blood type?" Dr. Sully said. "I don't know," Eli said. Dr. Sully looked at him for 1 second. Then he took a small card from his breast pocket, wrote something on it, and handed it to Eli. "We'll determine it at the hospital. Keep this." He paused, and for the first time something shifted fractionally in his professional flatness. He looked at the moss compress still visible at the edges of the sterile dressing he had applied over it. The sphagnum on the girl's bandage. "Yes. Good field decision. The wound was clean when I got to it. That's not nothing." He moved away with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything. In the organized movement of the operation, Eli found himself standing at the edge of the Ridge Road with nothing required of him for the first time in hours. Bikes repositioned, vehicles brought forward, the Scorpions loaded. Communications sent to what he understood to be a distributed network of people whose function was to manage the aspects of situations like this one that did not benefit from documentation or official involvement. The club moved with the coordination of a large organization that had been doing this kind of work for a long time and had refined its processes through extensive practical application. Eli stood at the edge of the road and felt the specific quality of stillness that arrived in the aftermath of sustained high-intensity function. Not peace exactly, not relief exactly. Something more like the sensation of an engine that has been running at maximum capacity for hours and has been taken off load and is slowly, incrementally returning to its operational baseline. He was standing there when Rain came to stand beside him. She had been given dry clothes from a saddlebag, a heavy flannel shirt, and a club jacket with the patch removed from the back, the fit enormous on her frame, the sleeves rolled back to free her hands. The improvised bandage had been replaced by a proper sterile dressing. She was still carrying herself with the careful uprightness of someone managing pain and choosing not to display its dimensions, but she was present and clear-eyed, and she was holding a cup from which steam was rising into the cold air. She held it out to him, coffee from a thermos that had materialized from somewhere in the club's travel infrastructure. He took it. He drank. The heat moved through him like something being restored, some central quality that he had not registered as absent until its return made the absence retroactively obvious. "You need a hospital," she said. Dr. Sully was thorough on this point. "Are you going to go?" The question had additional questions inside it. He could hear them. A hospital meant documentation. Documentation meant systems. Systems had teeth that had been applied to him before. "My father has people at Ukiah Valley," Rain said. "The documentation becomes whatever it needs to become." A pause. "You're not going back to a group home." He drank the coffee. The rain had eased to a fine cold mist. The storm moving northeast, the cloud cover beginning to carry the first tentative quality of pre-resolution, not breaking, but considering it. The forest around the Ridge Road smelled of wet earth and pine resin and motorcycle exhaust, a combination that had no precedent in his experience and that he stored without categorizing. "What happens to Briggs?" he said. "That's being handled." "And Curtis Vane?" A pause. That's also being handled." The same flatness in both answers, the same completeness of the statement. He understood that handled in both cases meant something he didn't need the specifics of and that she wasn't going to provide. He thought about Curtis Vane riding 20 miles with 300 men in a performance of grief and anger, managing the performance across every interaction and at every stoplight and at every moment when someone looked at him to gauge his response. He thought about the specific intelligence that required, about what it must have cost in the sustained effort of it, and about what it must have felt like to see Rain standing upright at the gorge rim with her spine straight and her eyes clear, and the specific expression on her face of someone who has already made the accounting and is ready to present it. He did not spend additional time on this. "What happens now?" he said. Rain looked down the ridge road to where her father was standing with Cutter and two other senior men. The conversation among them low and functional, the specific efficiency of people wrapping up an operation that still had open threads. Then she looked at the forest on the downslope side of the road, where the darkness between the trees was beginning very slightly to carry the first tentative quality of what the sky would eventually become when dawn decided to arrive. "Now you come out," she said. "For the first time in 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days, you come out." She looked at him. "It doesn't have to mean everything at once. My father said you belong to the club, and that means different things for different people who've been told it. For some, it means a patch and a bike and the full structure of membership. For others, it means something quieter, something that takes its shape over time, rather than arriving complete." She paused. "But it means there are people. It means when something happens, there is a number to call, and someone answers it." He looked at the coffee in his hands, at the warmth coming through the ceramic. He thought about the pine tree near his primary shelter and the scratch marks in groups of 5. 729 of them, each one a day. The discipline of maintaining the count, of insisting that the days be registered even when no one else would know whether they were or weren't. The loneliness of being the only witness to your own existence. He thought about what it would mean for that to be different. Not dramatically different, not immediately different, but different in the fundamental sense of the baseline against which everything else was measured. Different in the sense of the weather changing. Dale Callaway appeared beside them with the specific silence of a large man who had learned to move quietly as a professional necessity. He surveyed his daughter with a comprehensive 3-second assessment covering everything from the bandage to the posture, to the steadiness of the eyes, found the results acceptable, and looked at Eli. "We move in 10 minutes, he said. "You ride with me." He walked away before Eli could speak, which Eli understood was not rudeness, but the communication style of someone who had not experienced the possibility of a different answer as realistic in a very long time. Rain looked at Eli. "He doesn't do that," she said. Her voice had something in it that was careful but present. "Ride with him. He hasn't let anyone ride behind him since my mother." Eli absorbed this, filed it, not the habitual shorthand, but the actual process in the place where things went that he recognized as significant before he had sufficient context to understand why. In the weeks that followed his first night off the mountain, Eli discovered that what the forest had built in him had names in the world below the tree line. People called it presence. They called it situational awareness. They called it the quality of someone who had learned that inattention was a form of death and had chosen at the deepest available level not to die. The men in the club recognized it the way experienced people recognize most things worth recognizing, without ceremony, without extensive verbal acknowledgement, simply by the particular quality of their attention when he was in the room. He would say something once and they would remember it. He would indicate something with a gesture or a look and they would understand what he meant. He had no frame of reference for this. In his previous life before the forest, he had been invisible. In the forest, he had made himself invisible by choice. This was the first time in his memory that he had been visible to other people, and found the experience of being visible to be something other than a precursor to being processed. They came off the mountain as the sky began its first tentative negotiation with dawn, the light arriving not as light, but as a gradual reduction of the absolute dark. The trees beginning to separate themselves from the surrounding darkness and reassert their individual shapes. The forest becoming legible again after the long night of operating entirely by sound and touch and memory. 281 motorcycles came down out of the Mendocino forest in the pre-dawn gray, and the last of the rain on the logging roads and fire roads, and the single-lane asphalt of the mountain's secondary routes, the sound of them collectively a statement that the landscape itself seemed to receive and hold. Eli Voss sat behind Dale Callaway and felt the geometry of a motorcycle for the first time, the way it organized the air around it, the way the engine's vibration moved through the frame and into everything in contact with it, the way the road at this speed was an immediate and continuous fact rather than a background detail. His left arm, wrapped and braced, was held against his body. His right hand rested on the grab rail. He did not look back at the forest. He had already looked at it at the Ridge Road trailhead where the tree line began in the moment before Dale kicked the engine over. He had looked at it the way you looked at something you were leaving, with full knowledge that you were leaving it, not performing anything, not saying goodbye in any theatrical sense, just looking at it with the complete attention it had always received from him and always deserved. The forest looked back the way it always had, with the total indifference to his presence or absence that had been the most honest thing it ever offered him, and perhaps the most important. He turned his face forward. The bike moved down the mountain, and behind him the marks on the young pine tree would weather through the coming winter, and the winter after that, and eventually the bark would grow over them, and they would become part of the tree incorporated into the wood. The way everything the forest absorbed became part of it, and they would still be there, completely invisible, recording a fact that had mattered once, and that the tree would carry forward without comment. 5 years later, the Oakland Charter's designated training facility occupied 40 acres in the hills east of the city. A former private ranch purchased through a holding company, converted over 3 years into a functional compound bunkhouse workshop, medical station stocked to a level that would have satisfied a rural trauma center, and in the back 40 a section of ground that had been left deliberately wild. Dense secondary growth creek drainage, varying terrain, the kind of ground that rewarded careful movement and punished assumptions about what the ground contained. They called it the yard. The man who ran it was called the forester. He was 22 years old, which people who did not know his background found difficult to reconcile with how he carried himself and how the experienced men listened when he spoke. He was not large in the way the Charter's membership tended toward large. He was lean and calibrated with the kind of physical economy that came from years of making nothing available to the environment that wasn't strictly necessary. He had a scar along the back of his left forearm from a dog bite received at 17 3-puncture wounds that had healed imperfectly in field conditions, the scar tissue slightly thickened and differently colored than the surrounding skin. He wore it with the same neutrality he wore everything. His name was Eli Voss. He did not own a motorcycle. He had tried twice, had found that the machine's relationship with the road was not a relationship he particularly needed. What he owned was a 1994 Land Cruiser with 240,000 miles on the odometer, maintained to a standard that would have satisfied anyone who understood that a vehicle was a tool rather than a statement. He also owned a hunting knife, not the original, which had been retired to a shelf in his bunkhouse room when the paracord handle finally gave way beyond reasonable repair. The new one was better steel, a custom fixed blade made by a craftsman in Flagstaff who had spent years understanding what working knives actually needed to do. The handle was wrapped in the same paracord pattern as the original. The men who came through the yard's training program were experienced in violence in the way the Charter's membership was experienced in it, comprehensively and practically, without the abstract quality that theoretical training produced. What they were not, most of them, was experienced in the specific knowledge of how terrain worked, how to move through it efficiently and quietly, how to read what the ground was telling you and respond with the right action rather than the nearest one. Eli taught them this. He was not a patient teacher in the way the word usually meant, which was tolerant of slow progress. He was patient in the more specific sense of being willing to repeat accurate information as many times as it took for understanding to arrive without frustration and without revision. The information was correct. Either it was understood now or it was understood later, and the difference was time rather than any change in the information. Several of the men who had been at the Gorge that night were still in the Charter. Some of them had gone through the yard. They had a habit when they encountered Eli during training sessions, a particular way of looking at him that he had learned to recognize over 3 years of working with them. Not admiration exactly, not deference exactly. The specific expression of people who had witnessed something that had reorganized their understanding of what was possible, and who encountered the person who had reorganized their understanding on a regular basis, and who had never fully resolved how to carry that in ordinary professional interaction. He had learned not to remark on it. On a Thursday morning in March, 5 years and 4 months after the night at the Gorge, Eli was running a navigation exercise in the back 42 men, working a compass bearing across a drainage that consistently disoriented people who hadn't spent enough time learning to distinguish what they saw from what was actually there when his phone vibrated. Coming through town? Coffee. He finished the exercise. Debriefed both men provided specific corrections on 2 errors in their approach to the Second Creek crossing, assigned supplementary reading on terrain discrimination. Then he walked back to the bunkhouse, changed his boots, and drove 40 minutes into the city. The coffee shop in Temescal was a place Rain Callaway had selected 3 years ago on the grounds that the coffee was honest and the ambient noise level was sufficient to preclude eavesdropping without requiring elevated voices. She had returned to it for every meeting since. She was already there when he arrived, corner table back to the wall, laptop open, a second cup waiting at the seat across from her. She had calculated his transit time correctly. She was 23 years old, and she wore the specific armor of a person who had entered a formal institution and made the decision to be better at it than the institution expected. She had graduated from Berkeley School of Law the previous spring, and she had the look that law school produced in the people it hadn't successfully flattened, sharper, more specific, carrying a tiredness in the eyes from years of sustained demanding attention and a precision in conversation that made exchanges feel precise in the way good tools felt precise. She had the look of someone who had chosen a particular form of power and was in the early stages of learning how to use it. Her left temple still carried a faint white line from the gash at the gorge. She had never made any effort to minimize it or cover it the way you didn't try to minimize or cover something that had happened to you and that had produced a consequence worth being honest about. Eli sat down, took the coffee. DEA closed the Scorpions case, she said. She didn't preamble. She had never preambled. 47 convictions. The last appellate challenge failed 2 weeks ago. It's done. He drank the coffee. How long did you work on it? Peripheral involvement since second year. Full involvement for the last 18 months. A pause. The tracker was the centerpiece of the evidentiary chain. The device model, the transmission, records the GPS log showing the path from my house to the cabin, and then the stationary period before the signal went dark. 14 months of digital forensics to fully reconstruct the timeline. She looked at him across the table. The analyst who led the reconstruction said repeatedly that the original preservation of the device was remarkable given the field conditions, that the components were intact enough to read because the impact fracture pattern suggested a single sharp blow rather than multiple impacts. She paused. One rock, straight down. Yes, you had approximately 1 second to decide how to apply force. Less. She looked at him with the quality of attention that had not changed in 5 years, not altered by Berkeley or the bar exam, or the years of learning how institutional systems processed violence and attempted to produce consequences for it. The same direct, clear attention that had looked at him across a dirt floor in the light of a Dakota fire and made a rapid, accurate assessment of what he was. 47 people, she said, convicted on federal charges, off the road permanently. She paused. Because a 17-year-old boy who had been discarded by every system that was supposed to care about him decided to break a GPS tracker with a rock instead of a boot heel, and the way he broke it preserved 14 months of prosecutable evidence. She held his gaze. I'm not trying to give you credit. I'm telling you what the ledger says, so you know. He thought about the ledger, about what it meant that there was one, that actions taken in the dark, in the rain, in a forest where no one was watching, had a ledger at all. He thought about a boy who had scratched marks into tree bark because the alternative was letting the days pass without anyone noting that they had occurred, the profound structural loneliness of being your own only witness. He looked up. How is your father? Good. A brief pause and the precise professional surface relaxed by a fraction. Better. He stopped smoking. After 30 years. Dr. Sully apparently communicated something very specific about the trajectory if he continued, and my father has always had a particular relationship with Dr. Sully's lack of diplomatic cushioning. A pause. He asks about you every time I see him. What does he ask? Whether you're okay. She held his eyes across the table. Are you? Eli looked at the coffee in his hands. At the table. At the window beside them, where the March light was coming through at the angle, March light came in, the Bay Area low and specific and honest, the kind of light that didn't flatter but illuminated clearly, that showed things as they actually were, rather than as they might prefer to be seen. He thought about the bunkhouse where he kept a cot and a shelf of books and the retired hunting knife and nothing else that didn't serve a function. He thought about the 43 men who had moved through his program in 3 years, who called him by name and came back after training with questions that proved they had been thinking about what he had said, which was the only evidence of teaching that actually mattered. He thought about Thursday mornings when Dale Callaway came to the yard unannounced and stood in the parking lot with a thermos and watched the training without saying anything, the way a person watched something they had been part of building without needing to announce their role in the building of it. He thought about what it meant to have a name that people used, not as a designation or an entry in a file, not as a case number in a system that processed you along with 10,000 other case numbers, as the specific thing that located a specific person in the understanding of other specific people. The thing that said this is the one I mean, this is the one I know. He had been dead to the world for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. He had been visible to the world for exactly 5 years, 0 months and some number of days that he had stopped counting, because the discipline of counting days in isolation had been replaced by something that required different accounting altogether. And he was still learning what that accounting looked like, what units it used, how the ledger was structured. He knew it was not nothing. He knew it was not the forest, though the forest had made it possible. He knew it was the specific, earned, irreversible fact of being known, not cataloged, not processed, not passed between overworked caseworkers in fluorescent offices, but known in the way that required another person's sustained and genuine attention, in the way that changed what you were in the world from a statistic to a person. Yes, he said. Rain nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. He picked up his. Outside the window, the city moved with its ordinary Thursday morning indifference, the traffic and the people and the March light all operating on their own schedules, without reference to the conversation at the corner table, or the two people having it, or the night 5 years prior in a forest that was still there, still standing, still receiving whoever came to it and keeping whatever it chose to keep. Eli Voss was 22 years old, and he was in it, in the city in the Thursday in the March light. He was in it the way people were in things when the things knew they were there, when the days were being counted by more than one person, when the ledger had witnesses. He drank the coffee. Outside, a woman walked past the window with a dog on a leash, both of them unhurried. A delivery truck double parked across the street, and the driver got out with packages, and no one looked at him because deliveries happened and the world accommodated them and moved around them and continued. The March light came through the glass at its honest, specific angle and showed everything it touched exactly as it was. Somewhere across the city, a Thursday was happening to everyone in it, and he was in it too. And the Thursday knew he was there, and the people in it knew he was there, and the day after this one would know he was there, and the day after that. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was it, turned out the thing that all the other things had been shaped around all this time. The absence that the marks on the tree had been trying to fill, the thing the forest could offer the shape of, but not the substance, the thing that required other people to exist at all. He drank the coffee. The March light came through the window. Rain was across the table working on something on her laptop, the precision of her attention turned toward whatever the next thing was. The city moved outside the glass. Somewhere in the hills east of the city, the yard was there, and the men who came through it would come through it again tomorrow, and they would call him by name when they arrived, and he would already know theirs. He was known. He was here. He was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely present in the specific day he was living, without the marks and without the counting, and without the loneliness that had become so structural, it had started to feel like architecture. Just here. Just this. Just the irreducible, sufficient fact of being a person in the world who was known to it on an ordinary Thursday in March, drinking coffee in a corner of a city that did not know his name, but did not need to, because the people who did were close enough to reach, and that was the whole distance that needed to be covered. That was enough. That had always been enough.